In today's video, we're going to be diving into the upcoming pattern, taking a look here at our temperature pattern, what we're expecting as far as the Climate Prediction Center is concerned. Of course, we will dive into the model guidance as well later on, where things look very, very cold throughout the month of January. Basically, we're approaching kind of the halfway mark of the month now. We had a big question mark for what the second half would look like. We've known for a while that the first half would be quite cold, but now that second half looks like it could be just as cold, if not colder, and a little bit wetter. So we could see some snowfall opportunities in there. We're going to be discussing that. We have an ongoing snow system that's going to extend into the southeast and mid-Atlantic here over the coming 24 to 36 hours, and then we have more potential systems to track afterwards. So let's just take a look at it. This is the 6 to 10 day temperature outlook from the Climate Prediction Center, and as you can see, this is going to be for the 15th through the 19th time frame. A little bit of a transitionary time frame, and we do see colder temperatures still hugging that southeast and mid-Atlantic coast. Colder temperatures around for these areas. A little neutral to above average in the northeast there, even above average here in the north central states. And we could see below average temperatures actually for the west. It's been a long time since I could say that for the most part. When we look at the precipitation pattern, it's near normal along the eastern seaboard. A little wetter once you move inland for the south central states into portions of the Ohio Valley and deep south. And then still quite a bit drier along the west coast, especially that northwest coast, as well as the New England area in general. As we take a look here at the longer range look, this is the 8 to 14 day temperature outlook here. Still, again, from the Climate Prediction Center, of course. So this is for the 17th through the 23rd, looking a little bit more long range, and we do see them favoring strongly cold temperatures along the eastern states here. So we do expect that pattern overall to continue near normal, which means basically equal chances along the west. This is all based on percentages if you look at the bottom right corner of your screen. So this means 50-50 shot basically. As we just take a look at the precipitation though, things could get a little bit more favorable for snowfall in these colder areas. As you take a look, it looks like this storm pattern moving through in towards the east coast. We talk about the southeast, the mid-Atlantic, the northeast here, all looking at a more favorable precipitation pattern for snowfall later on, alongside continued cold temperatures. So a little bit to look forward to there. Our 3 to 4 week outlook has not changed. This is for the 18th through the 31st, but it was made on the 3rd. We are getting an updated version of this tomorrow. They make these once a week, so we will have more insight for the end of January, beginning of February timeframe, according to the Climate Prediction Center. Their precipitation forecast was quite favorable for the East Coast, which I don't think it's a coincidence that we see this when we look at the similar time frame. It looks like it's verifying kind of. I've mentioned that I think the South Central states and overall the plains was a little bit of a blunder here, as they've been above average for a while, and it's expected to continue. But overall, not too bad. When we look at the monthly outlook overall, it all kind of reflects what we've seen and what we expect to see. So I think they did an excellent job. And the precipitation, again, South Central would probably increase that and also decrease the Northwest, but and also the Northeast. So I think this precipitation map is not quite as accurate overall as the temperature map has been. Maybe we will set up with something like this later on in the month, but it hasn't really gone this way. And it isn't really expected to be this way as of now, but the temperature map is great, as I mentioned. When we look at the past 7 days, we are going to expand this to a 10-day outlook tomorrow, so we will be able to look at the first 10 days of January as a whole. But for the past 7 days overall, we've had severe cold just flowing from the north central states straight into the southeast and mid-Atlantic here, kind of as expected, and again, very similar to the Climate Prediction Center's overall January forecast. Warmer temperatures stacked along the west. We call this a positive PNA pattern. That stands for Pacific North American Oscillation. And this actually drives and forces the cold air into the eastern states, which we've seen take place. Now, let's get into some actual model guidance real quickly. Again, this storm is ongoing. This model run is the 12Z1, the most up-to-date European model run that we have right now. And as we kind of just move it more towards the time of recording here, about 7 p.m., we can see this snowstorm is still going to be impacting areas in the more central states like New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas, southern Missouri, even northern Texas here, like Dallas, Fort Worth. We've seen a wintry mix there in that area. And our low is forming. So this model guidance that we're getting is a lot more accurate. We have We mentioned yesterday that the low forming would give the models better data to work with. They kind of get to see where that low forms, and knowing where it's going to move from where it forms is a little bit easier than trying to predict where a storm's going to form plus where it's going to move to. So the question mark of where it is going to originate from is kind of done. That's going to bring in more accuracy and more agreement overall. I want to take us forward. I want to move towards overnight, because what we're going to see by 10 a.m., I guess this is really overnight. We're going right over it. We see snowfall kind of expanding into northern Arkansas, southeastern Missouri, southern Illinois, areas of Tennessee, even northern Mississippi, northern Alabama, and northern Georgia getting some snowfall here, especially on the front end. But that mix line where we see a lot of sleet, freezing rain, and even just plain rain mixed with snow perhaps is quite large in a lot of these areas. And that's going to be the trend throughout this storm. As we move this forward towards kind of the evening tomorrow, this is about 10 p.m., we could see snow starting in some of these mid-Atlantic and southeast areas that we expected along the East Coast, like North Carolina and Virginia. Again, quite a bit of wintry mix going on down here in the southern North Carolina, northern Georgia, northern South Carolina area. Snowfall really expanding northward throughout the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes as we have a secondary low. It's really the primary low right now, but overhead of the Great Lakes, our actual low that we're tracking is here. So these are kind of working in tandem to bring a larger area of snowfall throughout the Ohio Valley overall. As we keep going, that kind of dries up on the northern end. This is going to be about 4 a.m. We see some snowfall, some wintry mix, especially in southern Virginia and northern North Carolina, especially if you're in the more central regions of those states. I'm, of course, in southeastern Virginia, so I'm just biting my nails with every model run at this point. If you're really, really, really into the weather, you might relate to this, but it just feels like time moves so slow when you're kind of waiting to see what's finally going to happen and just hoping the models continue to favor what you want to happen. It's really, really grueling. And it's been a couple years since I've had to do this because we haven't had any expected snow. But I thought it might be different since I've gotten a little bit older, but I've realized that it is not any different, really. It's not really different at all. I'm still on the edge of my seat like a 13-year-old weather nerd I was, 11 years ago, or almost 12 years ago. So nothing really has changed in that regard. I guess that's a good thing. It's good to be excited. But as we move forward, we see that wintry mix is very, very large throughout North Carolina. A little bit of southeastern Virginia in there as well with heavy snowfall. It's really going to be a close call for a lot of those areas. This low moves offshore and comes to an end. Now, the interesting thing is that we do have some other models suggesting that we could have more snowfall expanding further north into Virginia. My overall opinion is that it's going to maybe fall somewhere in between of what we're seeing on the European versus the GFS model. I think the GFS and NAM model, the American models, are maybe overdoing the overall intensity of this system a little bit too much, which the NAM is very, very notorious for doing, by the way. The NAM model is almost overdoes everything, and that kind of sucks the storm northward a little bit. It latches onto that jet stream a little more because of that. But I think an overall slightly weaker storm than what those two models are showing is more likely. And overall, a bullseye, I'll show you in a little bit. I'll show you when we have a zoomed in map. But let's keep going past this storm. We get a little brief warm up, as we mentioned yesterday. It's interesting, we get another Gulf storm starting to get going. This one kind of meanders down here, doesn't really connect. Wouldn't be surprised. The clock is ticking for sure on this one, so take this with a grain of salt. But I really feel like this would have been a close call if we were a little closer, and I wouldn't be shocked if we see this try to trend north a little bit. This cold is rapidly moving in right behind it here. Definitely a part of the problem is that this storm is just outpacing the cold a little bit. But if we see any kind of changes in that regard, wouldn't be surprised if a couple hours later, for like Monday, Tuesday timeframe, if we had a little bit more of an interesting situation throughout some of these areas. Also, wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if we see this verify, but there's just a tiny amount of time to go. If we were to see a change, it would likely be over the next 24 to 36 hours. So keep that in mind. We'll keep you updated on that. But there's definitely a Gulf storm. The jet stream just isn't meeting it. Again, stronger storm would latch onto that a little bit better. So there's a couple things that could lead that to being a more northerly storm. And we've seen significant changes in some of these storms recently. So don't rule it out, but it's not necessarily a high probability of happening, but just mentioning some possibilities here. It especially comes close right around this point, 10 a.m. on Monday. Again, your jet stream and freezing line is somewhere right in here, and the northern extent of that storm is right here. So we would need a good 200 mile push to the north. Hasn't, it has happened before. Doesn't happen every time by any means, not even close, but we'll monitor it. As we keep going, we see we get more brutal cold, especially like the 14th, 15th, 16th here as that dives down the southeast coast. Maybe some of the coldest air of the year here during this time frame. Even get a couple of snow shower events and clippers trying to move down over the Great Lakes into the more mid-Atlantic areas, which in these very, very cold East Coast patterns does happen. When we think of clippers, we usually think of a storm that moves through the northern states, and that's even maybe a pretty far south clipper, but I have seen some clippers go underneath me in Virginia, Southern Virginia, which means that they can take trajectories much, much further south than what people think. And these create very interesting situations. Keep that in mind. Let's keep going. We almost get that right here, actually. Look at the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, and it almost deep dives straight into like the southeast, but it dries up. There is enough time for this to change quite a bit. This is 200 hours out, so we'll definitely monitor that. We warm up again as we get kind of a funnel boundary coming through, even a storm up there for the Midwest and Great Lakes perhaps. Cold front develops and likely, I hate to say it, severe weather potentially in this corridor, especially as we get a cold front here. We get really, really strong push of warm air up the southeast coast. So if we get something like this setting up around the 20th, you could be looking at another wintertime severe weather event. Some snowfall out west as well near the 20th. And then what we start to do after this storm moves through is we really start to get that cold push towards the east there. And this is very significant. This is another threat of a polar vortex event. Some of the coldest looking temperatures I have seen a model output in the upper Midwest right here. This would be significantly cold. And we'll talk about the temperatures a little bit more later on. But this would, if we could get this moisture a little bit further northward, kind of bring about another pattern of, multiple winter storms perhaps like we've seen here recently. Now, the GFS model, I want to see how far we've gotten into we'll use the 18Z run. We're not going to get all the way to the end today, but I want to use the most up-to-date one. And we see our initial storm here. Overnight looks about the same. You might notice that this mix is a little further north. As I mentioned, this GFS model is the further north grouping of models, as it's actually been throughout the entirety of this storm's potential. It's been constantly showing this storm further north than the European model. Even just the other day, it had no snow for Texas, really. I think it was yesterday, actually, in much smaller amounts than we saw in Oklahoma. The European model had a much better handle on those things, so we'll see if it's equally off the mark with the eastern end of the storm or not, but the European model has so far kind of outpaced it. We see this storm develops into a stronger low quicker, 1002 here before it's even over water. And we're seeing that rain snow line similar, but maybe a little further northward. And we're definitely seeing heavy snowfall extending further northward, even upwards into DC, Maryland, Delaware here, compared to the European model that had nothing even close to this. We'll track it and see, but that low is nearby the Outer Banks. And I mean, on the European model, we would have seen it much more like this. So pretty significant difference for within 48 hours of that point. We basically come to an end with that. Again, brief warm-up afterwards on this model too. Some clippers and more severe cold air around the 14th, 15th, 16th. Another kind of brief warm-up before we get another southern slider here, perhaps Saturday the 18th. We see South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, seeing some snowfall there pretty briefly before it moves up the coast a little bit. That could set up an interesting pattern as we get this, again, very brutal cold air at the end of this model run, similarly to what we saw in the European model. This is textbook right here. Strong positive PNA, cold push into the eastern states. And we've had some severe cold air so far this January, but this would be even colder by a pretty far margin. Keep in mind these models, with our previous cooldown, were showing a lot colder conditions than we ended up seeing. Maybe even, I would go as far as to say it might be half as bad as what we saw modeled at times. So keep in mind this one might be half as bad as what we're seeing here. There's only really only time can tell, really. We do see more Gulf energy in here still. Again, if any of this latches on with the jet stream, could be looking at an interesting situation, even a further south snowstorm, I would imagine, with this type of jet stream setup. But again, might be half as bad. You might see your jet stream much more on par with that, in which case we might see that latch on and head a lot further north, and you might be looking at the mid-Atlantic and northeast. I feel for you northeast guys. It's weird seeing areas far to your south seeing more snowfall than you guys have seen in a season. It's very weird. We're seeing Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama. I mean, that is odd, to see. I'm sure the Northeast will get their snowfall. We've been colder. We're expected to continue to be colder. I would be absolutely shocked if we continue to see little amounts of snow in the Northeast because the conditions are so ripe for it. It's just been a luck thing, really. When we look at the total precipitation, we're seeing a significant improvement here up and down the eastern seaboard as we get more storms coming through. Again, this will lead to snowfall threats throughout these areas over the upcoming pattern. When we look here at our precipitation anomalies, we see above average throughout this entire corridor. Again, much drier out west. I get so many comments, why don't you talk about the west? I do. It's hard to say warm and dry over and over and over again. I don't want to mention it too much because you get the point. But whenever there's something notable, I do make sure to kind of pan around the entire country and mention it. But when there's nothing notable, there's nothing really to mention. When we take a look here at the total snowfall on the European model, again, we get a couple of more northern storms coming through at times later on in the model run. So that's what all this is here, where we start to get more spread throughout these areas. For one thing, we get a Midwest system earlier on, and then we get more of an Ohio Valley system a little bit further eastward, and our initial system is right here, again, tracking through just like that. And that's what this snowfall is down here. So let's just kind of take it back a little bit and take a look at our first snowstorm. And this is the snowfall totals from that one. Grays is a dusting, if anything. Blues is where you're mostly looking at a chance of 2 to 6 inches. Mostly 2 to 4, by the way, here in these pockets for those of you curious. So mostly on the lower end of that 2 to 6 estimate. Again, we've seen a lot more in these areas than what the GFS model was showing. Overall, this is the European model, so this is what we were looking at as far as a forecast. Let's go ahead and zoom into the east here. Again, closer to that 2 to 4 mark, as we're seeing like 3.6, 3.7, maybe 4. So yeah, right around that 3 or 4 in the bullseye for a lot of these areas. Little to no snowfall here in central and northern Virginia. Whereas when we look at the GFS model in a minute, we're going to see maybe a bullseye setting up in that area. So within 48 hours, really within 36 hours, we are seeing a huge difference in the eastern end of this storm, which is unfortunate. I like to see agreement. I hate to see something like this. Really hard to track, and you can't really know which one's right or not. When we look at the GFS model here, again, this is for 240 hours. I'll try to add, let's see if we refresh it here. Yeah, we get almost to the end here. So a lot less in these areas here. As you can see, it's folded basically to the European model on the western end. So these areas seeing a lot. These areas seeing a lot. And then when we look at the east, I'm going to just zoom in here. Look at where that bullseye is setting up and where we're seeing 2 to 4 inches. I mean, we are seeing it all the way up in there. And then when we look at the GFS model, or the European model, almost nothing in these areas. Again, I'll pan back to the GFS now. 2 to 4 inches up there, and even 6 inches here. Whereas the European model for that area would be much more in line with maybe 1 to 3 inches. So massive differences for some of these areas, especially like Richmond, Virginia, areas in more of like the western areas like Lynchburg as well. That's going to be a big question mark for you guys. Charlottesville also. Is it going to be like this kind of dusting to maybe an inch look that we're getting from the European model, or is it going to be this plowable snowfall event that we're seeing on the GFS model? Think of the implications there. That is just absolutely madness. But when we look at the southern end, not too much of a difference. I mean, when we look at the rain snow line, I guess it's further south on the GFS model until we get towards the coast. So there's the GFS models. Here's the European models. We're not too far off on that. It's the northern end of the storm where we're getting huge discrepancies. So really, really interesting. When we look here at the European models temperature outlook, we see really cold for a while now is what we're expecting all the way through Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, even getting colder by that Wednesday, Thursday date, as you can see along the eastern seaboard. Then we finally warm up right around the 19th here, 20th, 21st, maybe a 3-day warm up. Finally, we haven't really seen many of those, even extending towards the 22nd, 23rd. But here comes that brutally cold air as we're looking at the kind of later portion of the month. Again, pulling up with 25 to 35 degrees below normal in these upper Midwest and Northern Plains locations. Well below normal for all of these areas as well. This would be a brutal Arctic outbreak if we saw something like this, which it is at hours 360, so keep that in mind. When we look at the GFS model, we're going to get some disagreement. I'm going to walk us through here, but we get colder, much less of a warm-up around the 20th. Here's the 19th, and then here's the 20th. Again, the European model had like a 2, 3, 4-day warm-up. The GFS model says forget about that. It's straight back to cold already by the 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd. 24th here, still cold. And then finally, it looks like some warmth is pushing eastward, but the eastern seaboard remains cold through the end here of at least our viewing of the model run, because that's the furthest we have right now. But with all that being said, let's take a little bit of a long-range look at the temperatures. This is the 9th through the 16th, according to your European Extended Ensemble model. This is a long-range model, sometimes referred to as the European Weeklies model. What we see here for the 9th through the 16th is cold, particularly in the southeast and south central states. 16th through the 24th, really cold as well. 24th through the 31st, still really cold, maybe spreading more towards the Great Lakes, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, so a little more north-based, which could help with snowfall probabilities, by the way. As we look at the 1st through the 8th, not quite as cold, and if anything, I would say a colder signal here out west, but nevertheless, the model does show cold in the east. As we move through the 8th through the 15th, still cold in the west and the east here. A little bit of a question mark there, but no sign of warmth really on this model, even through the midpoint of February, which take it with a grain of salt, but these models typically, especially the European Weekly model, have a little bit of a warm bias. So to see them showing colder times for almost over a month here, absolutely wild stuff. Anyway, I will keep you guys up to date with everything as I always do, so be sure to subscribe. You can even hit the bell icon for daily notifications when we upload so you never miss one. Be sure to like the video if you did enjoy it, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.